Thanks for joining me again on our Zoom channel. So we're talking to all the patrons today, and anybody that wants to become a patron, if you're on the appropriate tier, we can do these every now and again. And so we answered the questions, and we have a little talk about all sorts of things. We'll talk about whatever you like, and I asked people to put any questions on the comments first, so ask if there's any topics you'd like to raise. I didn't get a huge amount today, but one of them came from Sheila, and I thought what you actually put there, Sheila, is a great starting point, because Sheila asked the question, do we need to experience hardship to attain spiritual development? The Upanishad says to realize God, you must cross the razor's edge. And what small things can we do in our daily basis to make ourselves happy and follow the path to enlightenment? And I'd be interested to know what other patrons feel about this. So I think that's a really, really interesting idea, because the razor's edge, I mean, the idea of the razor's edge, I looked up the actual quote in the Upanishads somewhere. I wrote it down. It said in the Upanishads, this is the Katha-Upanishad, Upanishad, if I can pronounce it right. It says the sharp edge of a razor is difficult to pass over. Thus, the wise say the path to salvation is hard. And it was, of course, the name of a famous book, wasn't it? The Razor's Edge. But that was taken from the Upanishads. And as many of the sort of things in Western society have often been hooked out of the Vedic teachings. And so it's part, and that I remember from it, I read it some years ago, but the guy in it meets Yama, the god of death. And I seem to remember this Upanishad is all about, it kind of challenges the idea of Buddhism, for example, that says there's no such thing as the atman, no such thing as the individual self. So there's a lot of really fascinating things in that idea. But the basic question is about, why do we suffer? Why is it particularly, I think that, why is it that sometimes spiritually minded people in particular seem to be often the most challenged individuals? Because, I mean, I certainly, we can moan about it as much as you like, but in my own life, I've had some really very tough times early on. So did Jane, and all the genuine mediums, let me put it that way, all the real mediums that I've met through my life have usually had something pretty difficult to encounter in their life. Now, my take on it is, and you might think different, because I mean, what is the purpose and reason that we suffer in the first place, really, is a big question. I mean, right at the moment, my mum's in hospital, very, very, very ill, and I look and I think, why all this suffering? What is it caused by? And I think on a spiritual path, when you take the spiritual path, when you truly take the spiritual path, it is a bit like a razor's edge. You have to kind of find, almost like, you have to learn to take the middle way between pain and pleasure. You have to kind of learn that the hard way. I think, first of all, as a medium, you have to learn to have some of the type of suffering that the people that are going to come and see you have experienced. Because how can you truly help someone if you've not yourself had the sort of experiences that will give you the empathy, to give you something that makes you understand, crikey, I know what you're going through because I've been there before. And I think spirit also forces you to go through these paths sometimes, so that you go through it and you've also overcome it in some ways, because until you've overcome it, you don't want to be like these empaths that sort of say, oh yes, I know how you feel, I'm hurting so much myself. You've got to a point where you no longer worry about it. You know that, okay, these things have come into my life, I'd have no regrets about it because it's made me into the person I am. And I think it's only in adversity, isn't it? It's only when we're really up against the wall, when things are really, really harsh in our lives, it's those times that we make the biggest spiritual strides, or we discover who we are or who we're not. I often think, when you see these people in the First World War going over the top, you think, would I have had the courage to do that? You know, would I have had the courage? Would I have chickened out? Would I have been shaking in my boots, or would I have done it? We never know until we're faced with real adversity in our life. And that can come out in our lives in different ways. It doesn't necessarily always have to be physical suffering, because that's one path, isn't it? And often the healers, I think, go through that. But it often has to be where some of the most important things in your life are taken from you, you know, where your values are challenged to the core, where your everything you thought you believed in, you know, is taken away, where the friends leave you, when trust is taken away, when the carpet is ripped from underneath you, when people you thought you could rely on, you no longer can rely on, when you suddenly find yourself alone in the world. You know, all those things break many people. But, you know, and I look at some people and I think people break on the tiniest things sometimes. You know, you see people making a lot of noise about what I think are just little problems. And yet the people I meet when you do this spiritual work, and you meet people who sometimes have gone through tremendous suffering, you know, clients that come to you think, good God, you've been through hell. And yet that person is quiet about it. They don't make a big noise about it, you know. And others who've had hardly any problems in life, you know, will make a lot of noise. They say empty vessels often make the most noise, don't they? And so I think it's necessary, if you truly want to go on a spiritual path, that you have to embrace the idea that there has to be adversity and suffering at some stages on this pathway, all the way through at some, and you have to learn, I think, to pass through it, as it were, and that is the way when you start to learn that equanimity, which is the important mental state, I think, where we're not drawn emotionally by pleasure and pain, by success and failure, by what all the opposites that come to us in life of good and bad, but we can become on that, we can take that middle way, like the idea of the Taoists say about taking the middle way, the path, the way through the middle. And one of the things I've often think is much of it is non-attachment. Not much of it is from not being over-attached to the things of the world. I'm not saying we should reject the world. I don't believe in the Buddhist idea that everything we must step away from and go into nirvana. This is where the Upanishads comes in, actually. But I believe that we got to live life. You know, we've got to play the game. You know, it's a game of life that we live, and we must play that game of life. So I think that is part of the essence of being happy. And also, when we cease to have that over-attachment to the world, do we not then also start to live much more internally and less externally? And when I say living internally, I don't mean becoming all introvert and cutting off from the world, you know, I don't want anything to do with you sort of thing. We still live openly, but our focus is become within as the place where we find our happiness, not out there somewhere. Because it's only when we keep chasing things, we keep chasing this and that and the other, we get lost very, very quickly. So in many respects, suffering is something that comes into all our lives, and we have to accept, and it's easy to say and hard, we don't know it until we actually experience it. But in a way, suffering is obligatory, or no, rather, pain is obligatory, and the problems and adversity and is obligatory, but suffering maybe is voluntary, because how we react, how we act when we're faced with difficult circumstances determines our suffering. So in a funny sort of way, and I look at people that are really, really ill, it's hard to understand it really, because I think would I still say this if I was really going through that sort of thing? But a lot of the suffering we make in the world is because of our attachment to things, because of our willingness to surrender to those things and make them bad in our life, our resistance in some respects. But if we live from the inside, and if we live without too much attachment, could it not be that then we flow with life, and we are less there is less suffering in our personal life, because we have not because we've come to that point of equilibrium in ourselves, that we passed over the bridge, as it were, rather than build on it, the bridge of life rather than build on it. So that, Sheila, because I was thinking about it before I spoke, of course. And I thought, well, how would I answer that question? And that's my thoughts on it. That's my thoughts of how I think, that's the way I think really how we can find happiness in life. It's the same idea as, in many respects. I know we said it in the Upanishads, but it's also very similar to what the ancient Greeks, particularly the Stoics, thought, you know, that if you can change something, then do something about it, change it. You know, you don't want, you know, if you've got a thorn in your side, pull it out, you know. But if there's nothing we can do about something, then we can accept it. And I think that there's also a lot of mileage in that idea too, that Stoicism that says that, you know, change it if you can, but if you can't, don't let it pain you. Suffering is optional. So anyway, there's my thoughts. So how would you add to that, or like to say anything about that? Or any other?
I had an experience exactly as you described it. It was about 7 years ago, and I felt that time because I'd come to India, which of course is my ancestral home, but not the place where I've been raised. There was tremendous involvement in my life in areas that I didn't want it to be. And it used to really, really bug me. And I took exactly your idea. I took from the Hindu scriptures the whole idea that, well, is this an illusion? Is this Maya, as they call it, the illusion? If all around me is drama, and I'd done drama at university, so I could really relate to this. If this is all just a play, let me step back. And I stepped back. This is the point that you were talking about not being attached. So my way of detachment was stepping back and just letting people get on with it. They were arguing, they were making a lot of noise and everything, not necessarily anything to do with me, but I just stepped back. And do you know what? It was fabulous. The biggest lesson I learned, it was fabulous because I wasn't affected by it. And they showed themselves up as being crazy, to be honest. And the complete reverse happened. It gave me tremendous peace. So I had to apply my Hindu thinking there, but it definitely worked. It definitely worked. Just stepping back and letting the play carry on. And in doing so, I saw people for what they were, and it brought me tremendous peace. Because sometimes you think you're going crazy, that maybe you're the one who's creating the problems. But when you step back and you let others do it, then it gives you the evidence. So
yeah,
that
I think
helped.
you're absolutely right, aren't you? I think that's very much the case, isn't it? That we need to, this is what I say about the importance of living on the inside in many respects, because I had a similar sort of experience in a way. I mean, it happens a lot, but I read somewhere, somebody, I don't know who said it, but someone said, don't walk through the world, let the world walk through you, right? And I remember walking down the high street, and that came to mind. And it was like almost like a weird transcendental sort of feeling that everything was just unfolding, and I was just not really there at all. It was like, it was almost a dreamlike state. And it brought home to the idea to me, like you've been saying there, Sheila, that it's kind of like a dream. It's like, you know, the world is not that dangerous. Perhaps I was going to walk in front of a bus, yeah. But you know what I mean? It's like if we lose our, we get lost in the story, don't we? We get lost in the play. We get lost in the illusion of life. And I think that's in my opinion, one of the ways I think that we can escape suffering is by seeing our place in the world differently. You know, you don't get in trouble when you watch a movie, do you? You watch a movie, and people can, all sorts of terrible things can happen in a movie. So many people killed per minute, and although it's psychologically, you think, oh, it's not too good to watch that, you're not physically or mentally, you'd still know you're watching a movie. And in a way, the world's a bit like that. And I'm not saying we should live in an illusionary world, but I think it's like we know we're watching a movie. And if we look at the world and we know we're watching a movie, and just let it unfold in itself. And in many ways, I make the huge mistake of always chasing everything in life, thinking, I've got to do this, I've got to do that. I mean, I've always been you know, driven by deadlines, because I used to work in advertising years ago, you know, you're driven by advertising, by deadline. But actually, we've got to develop the complete opposite attitude to that and let it happen, let it unfold. And then our karma will bring into our life exactly what we need at this present point in time, you know. And I think that if we can take that attitude, which I think is almost very, very hard to do today, particularly in the West, then everything that's meant to happen will happen. You think?
Yeah. I mean, I think we create an identity for ourselves, don't we? We think we're this by the things that we have, the relationships, the people around us. But I think through suffering, pain, loss, when we go beyond it and we realise that we can survive it, we realise we're not what we thought we were. We're more than that. We're beyond that. Mm-hmm. So I think pain and suffering has that purpose of taking us back, helping us to become authentic, to become real, to see beyond. But I think that not just pain and suffering, I think lots of things in life can bring us back to that. But I think that has a big role in taking us beyond, like you say, the image, the identity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right there. You know, I mean, I talked about it there in relationship to the spiritual path or becoming a medium and so forth. We have to go through it through empathy, but actually, don't we all in our lives have to go through exactly the same thing? How can we ever understand the suffering of another unless we suffer ourselves? And how can we understand how to leave suffering unless we've already been there in the first place? You know,
about with spirit guides as well, about spirit, have you a person's spirit guide, or whether they need to have had incarnated an earthly life at least once, so that before they can be someone else's spirit guide, because then they understand what it's like to struggle as a human being on earth.
Yeah, I think Deborah, that the spirit, when we talk about in the spiritual sort of sense of what the spirit guides are, I think they would have taken earthly form to have all understood earthly life. They talk about the angelic kingdoms as being people that had never incarnated on earth before. But I think all souls to evolve have to take earthly existence, and it's in earthly existence where the most work is done. Because when we go to the spirit world, nothing's all solved. We still have in ourselves the same hankerings to become enlightened or to move away from suffering and things. It's not a suffering-free existence. We might have escaped the suffering of what we see in this world of physical pain and things like that, particularly at the time of death. But there's still karma there. There's still the need to progress. And actually, the place to be is here, because it's here that we can take the great strides, isn't it? And so the spirit world are seeing it from the other perspective, helping us to see things bigger. But actually, one thing that struck me about the spirit world is because the ultimate quest of all of us, of everybody, of all the beings, is enlightenment. It's awakening. It's to become gods. You know, it's to wake up. That's a big question, because what is that? But I mean, when we do, when a being on this plane, on the earthly plane, becomes enlightened, all the people in the spirit wake up to that same light, because we are spreading our light. We're doing it for this, not just in this world, but in the next world as well. So here is the important place. And I think the spirit guides are all part of the process of helping us to grow and help us, because we can connect. If you can't find a physical guru here on earth, then you can find your guru in the spirit. They will come to you through the spirit. We can get guidance whichever way we look, and our intuition and our unconscious is the key to those things.
So Craig, what do you think about the concept that we choose the life that we're going to come back into, and we choose the suffering that we're going to work through, because it's not a conscious choice, because obviously you're a soul at that point, but it's part of your plan to continue evolving?
Yes, I subscribe to it. This is how I would think of it, Christina. I think on the one hand, we're forced into situations in life because that is the result of what we've done already. So we have this, I'm very strong on this idea that we have karma, that the karma will draw us into this world. It will do different things in our life. Certain things will happen. Well, I don't mean karma necessarily being something bad. Karma is neutral. It's good and bad. It's a mix of all. So we have this force of what we've done previously has an equal and opposite reaction. So things are happening all the time because of that. And yet there is also this other strange element amongst it all that we would call free will. You see, we have the free will to choose to do a good thing or a bad thing. We have the free will to suffer or not, for example. We have the free will to be awake or to want to fall back into ignorance even, you know. We have the free will to want to drive forward. We have the free will to want to love or to hate, you know. So up to a point, we do have a choice as we come into this life, because that choice is based upon, the evolution of our soul. So some souls, I think, may be so tied up, for example, in behaviors in this world that they're thrown back into this world with the same negative behaviors again. But I think as a soul evolves, we get more choice about whether we need to incarnate at all, or if we're going to incarnate, what we're going to take on. So I think what you're saying is true, but only for those souls that are highly evolved, because I think that what happens as we develop spiritually, we have more choice about what we're going to take on. And that doesn't mean to say that because we've got more choice, we're going to necessarily come to this world and be multimillionaires. We might choose to come to this world to suffer in a certain way, because we know if we do that, that's what we needed that we didn't understand before. So we choose what is best for ourselves. And I think, and that might not necessarily, medicine sometimes might taste a bit nasty, but I think that that choice is also made in consultation with other beings that help us, because we're not entirely alone, are we? We're helped by other beings, and each of us, as we develop ourselves, we want to help others, don't we? We don't want to suddenly, if you become a spiritual person, you don't want to go hide away and say, I don't want to deal with anybody because I'm very spiritual. No, the immediate thing is that you learn the first lesson of spirituality, which is love or compassion. You know, so each being is helping each other being up the ladder, as it were. So when it comes to choosing whether we incarnate and what we choose for our life ahead of ourselves, I think is a combination of those two things, partly free will, but partly also the karma that we do have to work out in this life. And that's why by awakening, we gain control over that karmic power, I think.
Are there ways to actually change your karma while you're in this life? I mean, supposing you were going through a lot of suffering and you thought, I just can't stand this anymore, you know, can I change it? Are there ways to do it?
Well, this is what I'd say for that, Pat. From what I learned from all the Nadi readings and things like that, which I've found fascinating, of course, there was remedies, you know. So with every illness, there's a remedy. Now, I was fortunate that those things could give you a specific remedy for a particular problem. But there are a number of things we can do. I think we're making remedies all the time that help our life. Every time we do anything with an act, say, of love, every time we do an act of compassion, every time we do an act of service, all those positive things we do for others, that's going to ricochet and come back to us, not immediately necessarily, but it will come back to us eventually. So the best thing we can do is persistent action, good action, really, in ourselves, you know, and I think certain things have very powerful energy to them. For example, I think feeding people, I think, has a very powerful energy to it, because, you know, it's the essence of life, isn't it? It's the essence of life to feed somebody.
You'd have to do it because you want to do it. You couldn't just say,
you could say, I'm going to improve my karma, you know. But I think you get better value out of it if you do it with heart.
You have to want to do it for its own sake.
Yeah. I think you do it anyway. You get good karma by doing it anyway, even if you don't get something back from this. That's kind of a low level, but you pays better dividends if you do it with heart. And like I said, I think the other things that I think doing things for longer term, for the future, for others that you will never see the benefit of. You know, when you plant a tree, others will enjoy the shade. They say that planting trees has a very spiritual element to it. And doing something like giving cows, like we did, you know, in the Indian tradition, is supposed to be a very powerful karma clearer. And also giving to anything spiritual and temples and things like that is also supposed to have that. But I think, you know, we clear our karma basically by, you know, just being good and doing good.
Yeah.
Easy.
You know, Craig, how I see karma.
Yeah.
And if you want to think about past lives as well, you can sort of think of it as memory from this life or from past lives. And they are like patterns of behavior you carry with you, conscious, unconscious. Now, you think about it. How will I react in the next moment if I'm unconscious, according to the energy patterns and the memory that I carry in myself, right? But once you become conscious, you can literally break out of that pattern of behavior. I'll give you an example. I mean, some of you here have kids, maybe naughty children that you've experienced. I used to teach, by the way, before I became a lawyer. And maybe you'd have a child that wouldn't do homework for 2 hours every day. And you just know that if he could just come back after school, put in that 2 hours, he would get through his exams. But he could never see that. You would tell him, you would force him, but he could never see that, but you can. So he's got a pattern of behavior that he can't see past, right? And a lot of people have this, but you can. So, but if only he could wake up and just wake up one day and tell himself, hey, if I just did this, like mom said, for an hour or 2 hours, he could pass that exam. But just because he can't break out of that pattern, he won't be able to do it. And you can see it, right? As a teacher or as a mom, you can see it. But it's that. It's really like a pattern of behavior that lots of people can't break out of. But actually, the trick is to snap out of it and be conscious. Now, that's the main challenge, right? We've seen people like this, bad relationships, difficult jobs. Perhaps they're always fighting with people, or they suffer a certain way. So I think one of the ways really is how do you break out of those unconscious patterns of behavior? And all the religions teach you ways and means of doing this, even Christianity. So the Hindus have certain prayers that break and dissolve those energy patterns, I think from very high dimensions, like the Shiva chants or the Ganesha chants. But you've got other ways, like the Christian ways, right? Be kind, do good deeds. Even the Hindu religion teaches you to feed people and do kind deeds. I mean, the Nadi has certain prayers, like give 7 saris to unmarried women or something like that. They do have interesting things like that in that to make reparation for certain things that they say you might have committed in your past life. But I think it's simply that. And actually, everybody, I mean, this is what I think from just observation and living life, everybody has that moment where they can literally break out of unconscious behavior. It's just whether or not they see it, and whether or not, I guess if you want to put it that way, the forces that conspire at that moment enable you to have that moment of enlightenment, right? So it's not actually terribly complex. It's just about seeing. And I think maybe that's what Craig is talking about when he talks about sort of being conscious, being aware, waking up, being enlightened. And there are lots of ways to make people see. It's a difference between not seeing and seeing. This is my sense of
it's
what
very
it
much, isn't it? It's a bit like the way the brain works. I mean, the brain works like memory works, by kind of cutting a pattern through the neurons, and the more you repeat that, the deeper the channel gets,
Yeah.
like digging a channel through mud or something, until finally the river flows through it. And so repetition works. It works. And you think about it, the whole way we learn is, right, particularly as a child, repetition helps us, and through our lives, repetition, for good and bad, creates who we are. So what is that spiritually, what repetition is, isn't it, is all the techniques that we learn from all the different teachings around the world. Because all of the people say, oh, you've got to do this, you've got to do breath control, or you've got to observe this or do this, or all the different mantras or whatever, all the different things we do are all basically trying to retrain our instinctive self to become more ready for that conscious self. And like you say, once we wake up, once we're in the conscious self, then that kind of support mechanism is, we don't really need to do meditation anymore or anything like that anymore, because in reality, we've seen that everything is part of that same process. Is all me, and it's all waking up. And as I wake up, like the universe wakes up, as it were, isn't it?
Right.
So you're dead on with that, Elise.
Yeah.
And that's what
And I just want to pick up on that beautiful idea that people talked about before. I think, Craig, it was you and someone else. The idea where, you're watching a movie in life. Well, the way I see it is you're kind of on a train, right? And you're going on a long journey. I don't know. Maybe you're traveling across Russia or something. You got different scenery. Sometimes it's horrible. And sometimes it's breathtakingly beautiful, but you're just passing through. Sometimes someone comes on board and talks to you and it's a riveting conversation for the next hour. Maybe he gets off first or you get off first. It doesn't matter, but you enjoy it for the moment. Perhaps a really nasty person sits across from you. You can't wait to get away from them, but it's all just in the third person. It's like living life in the third person. And it becomes actually beautiful. It changes. People are fascinating, even the enemies or the haters, if you want to call them that. The great people that come your way. And the beauty of this detachment is that, and I, you know, is something that develops, and maybe you get aware of this over time, is if I want to be utterly involved in life, I need to be detached. I can't feel the pain, the tears. I can't sort of indulge in it, cry. My heart can't weep just because I've seen something incredibly sad or someone has come by me and it's terribly tragic. I just live through the third person, because if I'm going to help someone, I can't be caught up in my own tragedy or emotions. I've got to have that sort of detachment. I'm just passing through, but in the meantime, I'll do all I can, if it's in my capacity and my role, to do the best I can for you. But at the same time, I can't do that if I'm falling over myself and not being able to sort of live in the third person. And life is actually quite beautiful. It's finite. That train journey is going to end at some point. So you just make the most of it, and you enjoy the lavender fields as it goes by and other scenery and the good bits and the bad bits. But once you get to that sort of balance, you find that you have the capacity to do so much more, including face the tragic stuff. I did meet a monk in Thailand, and this was when I was younger, and I'd gone through a very difficult patch. He kind of just told me to be happy, and he told me something along the lines of, it was translated to me from Thai, but he told me, emotions are not necessary here. And it took me a while to understand that. But over the years, I've begun to understand that just because someone is having a tragedy next to me doesn't mean my own heart has to rip apart and cry and I can't help that person. It's a sense of balance and detachment. I just think of it as living through a third person, but you can think of it as watching a movie or however works for you. But I like the idea of trains, right?
Yeah. A lot of gurus have talked about third person like that. Gurdjieff and people like that used to refer to themselves in the third person. Only talk, never mention the word I. Would only ever say him, you know, being himself, you know, which I think is quite interesting, because that's like an inner discipline that they use there, almost to sort of separate themselves from this I am suffering sort of thing, you know. And so I think that's lovely what you said there. And I often think, you know, like you say about emotions there too, I think emotions are quite dangerous in many ways, because they're attachment energy in many ways. I'm not saying feelings aren't, I'm not saying compassion isn't, I'm not saying that is, well, that could be, even a thought could be actually, but we tend to always, don't we, in our world, we always look like on television, it always has to be the emotional stuff. It's the stuff that everybody wants. It's always the emotional stuff, because it's all worldly again. It's all grab the world, you know. But the real happiness comes, doesn't it, when you're not detached in the way, like you described it well, actually. It's like you're in the world and not in the world, you know.
Yeah,
you're doing the two things at the same time. You know, you're taking on the whole world with everything, suffering and all, and experience it in its totality, and yet simultaneously you're not of this world. It's something else in a way, you know?
And the thing is, it's got to be trained and practiced, and through whatever spiritual practice you have, that I think everybody can do as they walk this path in their own capacity. It may not be something that just comes like magic, or maybe it can for certain people who just have that snap of enlightenment
No,
in
I
a
think
moment of suffering.
even those that get the snap of enlightenment have done millions of years of work before they get that snap. They go, and that's the other thing, I mean, but everybody thinks they want instant happiness now, and they want someone else to do it for you, you know, and I deserve it, you know, and yet they're never prepared to put in any work whatsoever, you know. As mediumship is one of the worst, you know. Everybody wants to be a medium. I don't know why, because if they knew how much suffering a medium has to go through, they run a mile. But the most of aren't true anyway, but the true one knows. But everybody thinks, oh, it's a marvelous thing because they like the glory of all this, or they all want to be a guru because they're the glory of it all, but they don't know what that person's done, not just in this life, but in all the lives that have come before, and the terrible paths they might have been down in order to get to that point. Yeah, it is a, how did you describe it, as the razor's edge, didn't you, Shiva? You know, we'll come right back to that. We really covered the topic here, haven't we? But it is the case, isn't it, that it has to be really a mixture of embracing the world and all its suffering and accepting it. I mean, one of the other things that a lot of the teachers do is there's this idea of tapas, you know, that where some teachers will take on a life of hardship deliberately, you know, because and also I also wrote in my book about the Agori yogis and things who take on really awful paths in order to detach themselves from the world by seeing it only as just the illusion of the world. You know, we're not attached to it because it's just the illusion of the world. It's like if you've got pain and you focus on pain and you look at that pain and you think it's not pain, it's just sensation. And your mind can get into a point, because a lot of people that do things like all these superhuman acts that they do for theatre type things, they get into this zone where pain is no longer anything that concerns them. It is merely a sensation, and they're able to again separate their mind from the pain response. And I think that's what we're doing in the sort of things we've talked about here in a funny sort of way, isn't it? We've learned to separate our mind from the sensations, or see it as for what it is, you know, the reality being.
And Craig, you know, when Sheila posted that lovely quote, which I saw on Patreon, and I thought about it in the context of my own life and what I understand. I think what suffering does is, and especially intense suffering, it makes you understand your own smallness. And to be anything in this world that's meaningful, you have to understand how small you are, that you're not your thoughts, you are not your friends, you are not your, I don't know, your job, your career, you are not all of these things, you are something else. What are you? The first step to that for most people comes from suffering, because you wouldn't look internally if everything just went brilliantly as your ego wanted, would you? You might just end up with a bigger ego. So I think suffering is really important. And I think people on a spiritual path, now I can see that you sort of, you know, you believe in past lives as I do. So it's a buildup of sort of experiences from that. But I think suffering is sort of a way to dissolve your karma and kind of understand things with a heightened perception, right? Because when you understand how small you are, you see the world differently and how much you do not know. And when you start seeing that, it's the beginning of everything, to be honest. Yeah. You can literally be reborn again. Now, most people can't get to that spot or close to that spot without having some kind of suffering in their life. So why do spiritual people have the most suffering, if indeed that's true? Because it's so necessary to the work that people do. They have to go down that route and see everything about human nature, what they're like, the ugliest, the best, the worst. The tragedy of it, actually. What you're seeing is the tragedy of it. You know.
You've also got, and one of the other things, you've got to strip away the ego too, because I think sometimes these things humiliate you almost. You know, they bring you down from your high horse, as it were. And although many people who have still followed the spiritual path have huge egos, and that narcissistic type of attitude that can also develop with awakening. I mean, that's another dangerous, perhaps a whole talk sometime. It can happen, but I think ultimately you've got to also learn that, like you say, you're small. You're the whole vast universe, and yet at the same time you're just a grain of sand. You have to. There was a Jewish teacher that said, was asked, why don't people understand God anymore? And he said, because people are not prepared to stoop low enough. You know, and I think that is kind of, in my way, I think in many ways sums it up, doesn't it? That, you know, we cling on to these illusionary ego that we pass through the world, we live a false life with false desires, thinking that everything's out there and everything can be solved for us. But really, it's so simple that if we can just be what we are and live a life without grasping and running after things, and actually give rather than want to take all the time, actually love instead of wanting to hate all the time, actually sometimes surrender rather than wanting to achieve, it's easy. You know, we could be happy.
Easy. I wouldn't have to be a lawyer and see all the things that I see.
I'd like to have you as a lawyer. I must say, I've not met many lawyers like you. Most lawyers are Rottweilers.
Well, you know, it's like, I don't know, it's an interesting world. I mean, you know, I won't say where I work, but what I see, it's like a microcosm of the universe, really, of people, all sorts, more bad than good. But that's just a small segment, I mean, of life, right? But still.
Well, a lawyer that understands karma is in a pretty good position, actually, because surely that's what it is all truth's about.
I mean, I've had my own spiritual path too. And I would just tell you, it's not been easy. You know, it's a growth process that has brought me really low and seen things. I mean, when I have conversations with my spiritual teacher, I think people who might overhear us might think we're like from outer space, you know, and we've often laughed about this. The things we talk about, they won't think we're sane at all.
It's always the case. I mean, when I went to India, and you know, I've just been sort of looking through my book, Be Happy, the new one, you know, I'm correcting some errors I've spotted in there. And I think one of the things I just read it a minute ago, I said in there about anybody watching me and Jane talking to Zaravana from the outside would think we're absolute nutcases, because the things that we were, it just seemed complete. We never met him at that point before. And you just, because he was talking to us, for example, he's talking to me and talking to Jane, and the same sentence would each hit both of us in a different way. They talk on a different level, you know, it's not normal talk. And he's already anticipating our thoughts before we say it. And of course, being a medium, you're trying to pick up his thoughts at the same time. So there's this weird thing where you're getting half sentences because you've almost done it inwardly beforehand. Yeah. And that happens with many great gurus when you meet them. They're on an inner level with you. And and people would think you're absolutely bonkers.
That's right. That's right. And the thing about being on a spiritual path as well is you learn a lot of things that are mystical and strange, and even, I would even say, I mean, that's the black and that's the white, to put it in a very simple way, ugly things, dirty things, all sorts of things. And, you know, it's like when you talk about these things, people would just think you came from the nut, where the nutcases are in their world. So it's bizarre, you know. But it's really nice to be part of this group and hear everybody's thoughts. You know, I've never done this.
It's always good when spiritual people get together, because I mean, when we all have a few spiritual friends in life, I hope. And when you get together, it's sort of like, it's a new energy. It's like the new time, you know, and you go away, you never get bored with each other. You always get refreshed, and you always get, come away a little bit, you know, inspired by each other, and both coming away enhanced by one another. And I think, you know, if only people realize just how good spiritual things are, you know, not see it as a sort of a chore that you've got to do, you know, go and do my yoga or go and do this or go and do that. But when you do, when you really take on a spiritual path, don't you, it becomes something that is really uplifting. When you meet spiritual friends, you have share spiritual thoughts, you know, it becomes a really uplifting thing for your life.
I always wanted
I just wanted to say I'm so grateful that you've got this little group going. You know, it's an opportunity to get with spiritual people that is a little hard to come by where I'm living. So I'm grateful.
I tell you, it's hard to come by everywhere.
I have a question, Kelly. I've always wondered, when you leave the spirit world and you incarnate back to Earth again, why is it that are we meant to forget that we've come from spirits or our past, or why do some people forget? Like people, while we're here, especially if this is supposed to be like learning hard lessons in this life. It's supposed to be a hard life
Yeah.
to progress. So are we meant to forget while we're
I think
still on
I think we do have to kind of forget, really, because you imagine if you're taking on, supposing you'd had a life of absolute suffering that had really broken you in that life, you know, and then suddenly it's swept clean, you've forgotten, and you're just now basically who you are, like as you were when you were a child, innocent self again. If we can wipe away that experience and then start again with a fresh sheet, I think it gives us, because otherwise there'd be no need for death at all, would there? Because it would just be one continual process if we just carried on that same life endlessly without any clean sweep, as it were. And we become fossilized, I think. I don't think we get the chance to have another try, have another go, and then we can come back to those knowledge again. Because I think when we go back into the spirit world, we remember the previous lives and we recognize that the people that are in our lives, Christ, I'm married to the person that was my worst enemy in the previous life, and now we're the best of people. You know, we all rejuggles, and we work out our destinies in a different way, until eventually we all don't need to come back to this world again. We can move on to the higher planes beyond all of it.
Can I ask something about the Nadi leaves? Are they the same as the Akashic records?
Well,
But just words, aren't they, really?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, people talk about the Akashic records, but
Yeah.
you know, I don't know
Well,
whether it's the same thing or not.
well,
You know,
what I would say is the origin of the Nadi leaves is also shrouded in a lot of mysticism and mystery. It goes back so old, so far back that nobody really knows for a fact where they came from. And it's also gone through a process of translation, I think, at certain stages in its history. Say, for example, 500 or 600 years ago, my Nadi leaf reader told me it was retranslated from a more ancient script. But obviously, holy people would have done that, right? Now, the Western way is to look at something like the Akashic Records, and it's a term, I think, right? Maybe you can see the Nadi leaves as some sort of deep mystical science from a former time when people were maybe more spiritually aware and connected. Now, if you look at holy and spiritual people today of any religion that's old enough, you'll kind of realize that they have great discernment, or what we would say powers of intuition, to see a person. I think Craig and Jane have that too, because they're spiritually practiced and aware, and most spiritual people can develop some capacity of this. And perhaps in the past, some of these yogis, you know, shrouded in mystery and mysticism today, they had the ability to see into the future and write this. And I think some Indian yogis as well today may also comment on it or have spoken about this, the Nadi leaves. And they think about it as a kind of ancient yogic intuitive science that goes back to the rishis, you know, the saints. The saints, we only have mystical names today, but they still exist. I mean, because of the leaves and because they're still known in the world today through various means, right? Holy texts and that kind of thing.
Well, a lot of the Nadi leaves came originally from Saint Augustine, didn't they? And he was the first pupil of Shiva. And the question is, who was Shiva? You know, because I mean, when you look at Shiva, he's almost like a spaceman, isn't he? Sometimes, you know.
Can I just say something there? You've, as usual, hit the nail on the head. The word Akash is Sanskrit. It means sky. Means sky, as you know. So I have a slightly different take. And then, of course, you have the Great Hall of Records, which hopefully one day will be discovered in the pyramids. I wait for the day. So many. We have so many. But I believe that this is my own crazy belief, but it's up to you what you will think. I believe that we originate from the stars, from alien beings. And where do I get some of that evidence from? If you look at the ancient Egyptians, when they buried, mummified and buried their kings and queens, etc., they used to have windows which were like shafts in the pyramids, which would directly show Sirius, the star. And the BBC did a fabulous program once where they kind of did a computer kind of regeneration of how the skies would have looked during that time where the pyramids were. And do you know what? Exactly where those great pyramids were, those shafts exactly focused on Sirius. So are the Akashic records things from ancient beings long ago? Was Shiva and the deities all alien beings? We talk about Hanuman, the god, the monkey god who flies. He's actually flying in the skies, etc. If we look at the ancient Greeks, the Greek gods, very similar to the Hindu deities. They're all up in the mountains, you know, they're on Olympus, we're in Kailash. So much similarity. So I actually feel, in a nutshell, that this wisdom, the Akashic records, have been given from ancient alien beings long ago.
But they must be being, they must be being written all the time, though, mustn't they? As we experience things, surely that's writing the records all the time, or the leaves, or whatever.
Well, the Nadi say that they've all been written in one time. They're not continuously been. I think I'm right about that. They're
the
just
future
there.
would be fixed, wouldn't it? You wouldn't be able to change anything, and we have free will.
This is the dilemma. You're right. This is the dilemma. You know, to be or not to be. Can you change? According to some people in the Nadi, you know, they're saying that yes, you can do remedies. I personally believe you can't do a complete remedy. I think you can only lessen the blow.
Yes, that's absolutely. I was told that. Absolutely, you can't. You can negate it. So if something's going to happen, it's going to happen, but maybe not in such a terrible form.
But it depends about whether or not you believe in this concept of linear time, or you believe more in the quantum perspective of time, which means that time is moving backwards and forwards, and all possible outcomes are all occurring at the same time. So there's a school of thought that whereby you can actually, so if you meditate or you manifest, you can actually push manifestations and backwards into time to try and get a better outcome from something that's already happened in your past. So I think like that would be my take on it, that time's not linear. And the other thing about the records, I think, Pat, is the Akashic records aren't written down. So that like the Nadis are a written down format, which may have originated from the same source as the Akashic records, but you can access your Akashic record yourself. So why with the Naadi you need to go to a reader and they need to find this physical manifestation? You can actually access your own Akashic records or go to a reader. So I think to me that's the difference.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. But again,
and I think what the ancients did, didn't they? They conquered time. These were people who had superpowers, conquered time. Now, superpowers. Perhaps I think one of the things I think interesting what you said, Christina, there is the quantum world, because in the quantum world everything happens all at once, doesn't it? Past, present, and future all at one. So perhaps these great seers, because we already exist in the quantum world. Our consciousness is somewhere back behind this material, perhaps in the quantum world, and they saw the whole thing. That's what the Akashic record probably is: consciousness of the quantum part of ourselves. And they saw it and put it into leaves, and that is perhaps what we connect to, the overmind. Perhaps we could call that the Akashic record, the universal mind. And that's the marvelous thing we've got access to. And in that state you can see whatever's happened, whatever will happen, and whatever can happen. But there's still this free will, because there's still
Craig, I have a request. I've asked about this before. I think your talks on the Naadi are really, really interesting. I would very much like to look at the Naadi in greater detail. I mean, through yourself, as a program, maybe later, as a video one day. I'd love to hear what they have to say about how we should approach certain events coming in the future and what we should do about it. It's kind of like forewarned is forearmed. I'd love to know their thoughts and how they would suggest that as a collective, as a group.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, I don't think I haven't found nadis that will tell us what the future of the world is, if that's what you're meaning, because it would only tell us on a personal level. Because the objective is the object. You think what's the objective of the nadis? It's not to warn us about the future. It's to show us our karma, really, to show us what's coming up in our lives and how we can change things for the better. But the hidden agenda is it's a means, it's a path to awaken us. It's an enlightenment method. That's the whole thing about it, is it's to awaken you. And people approach it for all sorts of different reasons, but its goal is to wake you up, so that you live your life in a completely different way, not necessarily more moralistic or anything like that, but more awake to the fact that, my God, this is unfolding exactly as I was told. Now, how do I respond to this world? Like, things are happening today in this week with me that I was told about in the Nadi in detail, and I think, God, it's what happened, and you don't have to do anything about it. It just unfolds in an incredible way, and I think, and so I think what it's doing is it's a method for individuals to seek enlightenment. It is, otherwise, I don't think it's a Nostradamus, as it were, if you see what I mean.
Right.
But we could always do something again. We can get Mr. Prakash on if you want to do some Nadi's readings there again, like I said with him. But his English is so hard to understand, even for Indian people. Well, we're coming quite close to the end now, I think, guys, aren't we? Yeah, we're coming to the end now. So I think we ought to finish, because I keep them to an hour. Less is more, isn't it? I'm looking forward to the next one, because it's been so nice talking to you all, and such an interesting discussion. So I'm going to close it now. I'm just going to say at the end a little, let people know, because I put this one on YouTube, I think, because it was an interesting one, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Just to say, if you've been enjoying this, folks, I mean, you can join us on Zoom if you become a patron, and that money from the patron helps with our work. I don't take any money from it. It's all there just to help the spiritual work move forward, and ultimately for us to get a spiritual center and do some charitable work with it as well, and all sorts. So thanks for joining us here, and have a look in the description below, and you'll see how you can become a patron and join us and meet all these lovely people that you've been seeing today. Okay, well, thanks, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Happy New Year. Bye.
Bye.